Groovy. Context of white supremacy. Gus T. Renegade. Justice. Another episode of The Cows. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And hopefully be able to provide constructive information on what racism is, how it works. Being a victim is tough. Before we get started with today's program, definitely want to remind all the listeners, please join the Facebook group. Back of the bus, put a lot of time and energy into the Facebook group. His website, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. You can check out the Facebook group and his website. Lots of constructive information. If you join the Facebook group, you get an opportunity to see what past guests, what comments they've had about the program. Lots of other non-white people have joined the Facebook group. You can swap your own views about what different people have shared with us on the Cows. We've done a lot of shows at this point, so please join the Facebook group. Link for it is on the show page for the context of white supremacy. If you look at the top right corner on the show page, you'll see a link for, you'll actually see a small box with 3 links. One of them is for the MySpace page, the other's for Twitter, and then the Facebook group. So click on it, join the group, very much appreciated. Back of the bus thanks you as well. Moving forward, today's program, this is continuing to show the appreciation, I guess I would say, for Dr. Martin Kevorkian and what he shared with us previously on the context of white supremacy. He was on the program in May, and he was talking about his book, The Color Monitors, the Blackface of Technology in America. And while he was on that program, ironically, I asked him, are you a white person? And instead of just saying, yes, I'm a white person, moving forward, he talked for about 8 minutes. And during that 8 minutes, he mentioned, pulling from his personal library, Professor Ian Hani Lopez's book, White by Law. And he talked about how who is white has changed and how the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, have changed, revised, edited who can be a white person, what it means to be a white person under the system of white supremacy. If you've been following, we had Professor Lopez on the program just 2 weeks ago. Very constructive program, lots of helpful information. If you got his book, if you get the revised version of White by Law, flip it over. You'll see on the back one of the people who did the review for that book, the revised version, our guest today. Lots of helpful information, which I, Gus T. Renegade, almost tossed away completely. One of the huge errors I narrowly avoided in the entire time I've been doing this program. I originally spoke with today's guest, asked him to come on the program to do the book that is mentioned on the back of Professor Lopez's book. That book is called Roots 2. Very interesting book. Promised today's guest I would give him an opportunity to share about that as well. I looked at that book, and I thought, I don't know if this is really as constructive for talking about and breaking down white supremacy as I was like. So I thought, maybe I won't do this book. I don't know. Little thought just came in my ear. Why don't you check and see if he's written any other books? Flipped through, I saw today's guest has also authored the book we're going to talk about today, Whiteness of a Different Color. Phenomenal book, extremely constructive in understanding racism, white supremacy, what it is, and how it works, especially following right with White by Law, analyzing how the classification, who gets to be white, how that has changed. Different people that used to not be white, how they got to be white, incredibly helpful information in this book, which I almost pitched, Avoided Catastrophe. He's on the program today, thankfully, to speak with us, Yale's Dr. Matthew Fry Jacobson. Are you there, Dr. Jacobson?
Yes, I am. It's good to be here.
Outstanding. Could you please share with our listeners anything that you think would be helpful for them to understand who you are and what it is that you teach at Yale?
Okay, well, I guess unlike Mr. Kevorkian, I'll cop to my whiteness, although we can discuss over the next several minutes or hours how complicated a story that is. I'm Jewish American. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. I was born in 1958 and was just kind of coming to consciousness against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And while the all-white area that I grew up in was not exactly a roiling context in civil rights politics, nonetheless, that was kind of rumbling through in the background throughout my childhood. And I really think that that's the most important thing in kind of figuring out where I've put my energies as an adult. I've been studying race and racialized relations and ethnic studies pretty much from college onward, and have written now several books on race and racism and also on U.S. imperialism, and have done a fair amount of work on the relationship between foreign policy and race.
Outstanding. I did want to point out, I'm not picking on Dr. Kevorkian. He did say that he was a white person.
Yeah, no. I totally understand what it was he was saying when he made that a complicated answer.
Yeah, he as I said, he shared lots of helpful information. If he had just said, I'm white and move forward, it is very possible you would not be on the program today, because I got that from what he said in that 8 minutes of rambling, white by law. That was how you ended up being on the program today. So it was very productive. And I told him that on the program, that his rambling was helpful. I would have stopped him if I didn't think it was. Very constructive. So you've already said you're a white person. That's got that out of the way. This program, context of white supremacy, I have, unfortunately, as I'm a non-white person, concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy. And the definition that I use for that is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they say is not white. Do you think that such a system exists, and do you think that is an accurate definition of that system?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say it's a workable definition. The one place I might add my own amendment to it is just to say that the word dedicated, I think, conveys a sense of knowing that is not always the case. I think there's also a story here of complicity and the kind of political unconsciousness of white supremacism that's as important and as damning, but is a slightly different story than the more intentional brand that you seem to be describing.
I want to be clear, because we've had this pop up on the program before, where people have said or spoken about consciousness and knowing, that sort of thing. I'm not really addressing whether or not white people consciously practice racism, white supremacy. I'm simply addressing a system.
Participating in those structures, yes, I absolutely agree.
Okay. Do you think that definition is accurate, though? I just want to be clear.
Yes, I would say so.
Okay. Want to, again, point out for our listeners, at this point, I've lost track of how many white people have been on the program, because I generally have more white people on my program than non-white people. So I lost count somewhere around 10. But at this point, every white person that has been on this program has said, yes, we have a system of white supremacy, and yes, that is an accurate definition. Every white person except for two, and one of those two who did not agree, former imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Just pointing that out I think that's funny too, but I'm just pointing that out to clarify for our listeners at this point. I don't even know how many white people we've had on the program at this point, but it's been a lot. Non-white guests that there have been a lot less of, it's about 50% think that there is, or excuse me, about half of the non-white guests that have been on the program do not think that there's a system of white supremacy, and or they don't think that definition is accurate. I think that is very telling in and of itself about my feeling that white people are way more informed about racism, white supremacy, what it is, and how it works. I could be incorrect, but my program I'm submitting as Exhibit A, evidence that I am bringing forth. Dr. Jacobson, if you could tell them about your book, Whiteness of a Different Color, just why you decided to get into that project, and if you could give them a summary of what that book is about.
Okay. Well, this started for me in research on another book I was working on, and which was a study in immigration history. I was looking at European immigrant groups around the turn of the century. And in the documents, the archival sources I was looking at, I kept finding what to my late 20th century eye seemed to be very peculiar usages of the word race, or very peculiar kind of racial terminology for different groups. Groups like Hebrews, Mediterraneans, Nordics, Celts, Slavs. I mean, all of these groups that you could kind of vaguely, you knew who was being discussed, but it was the way they were being discussed and the way they were discussing themselves that was very different from our own regimes of racial ways of thinking. So that got me to really just wondering and posing the question: what happened to all these 19th century racial groups? How do the 19th century's Hebrews and Celts and Slavs become the 20th century's Caucasians? And what are the stakes at that? What are the kinds of cultural and political contests that are in play to make that transformation come about? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And how is it that our political culture seems to, at its core core, operate by processes of racialization or re-racialization? So that's where the book Whiteness of a Different Color came from. It came from that basic question about the 19th century sources that I was looking at. Now the set of questions sent me both forward and backward in time, and the book that we're discussing today covers a pretty large sweep of U.S. history. I end up beginning actually in 1790 for reasons that I'll describe in a minute, and carry it forward to about 1965, which was a major piece of immigration legislation. Now, 1790, and there are really two stories I'm trying to tell here. One is the bedrock story of white supremacism that really structures American political life and has from from the colonial period, really, but certainly from the revolutionary generation and the moment of the first convening of the Congress. From that moment forward, white supremacism has been a kind of bedrock structural feature of the United States. So that's one story that I'm telling, and I'm trying to really give evidence for how that's true and how true that is. The other story is a story of the instability of race itself and why it is that different groups at different moments might fare differently in the overall kind of racial scheme. Why is it that the Irish suddenly, in the second half of the 19th century, aren't exactly white? They're not exactly non-white either, but they aren't exactly white. They're Celtic, and they're understood broadly to be, by people who aren't Celtic, several cuts below the superior Anglo-Saxon. How is it that kind of racialized scheme comes about? And how is it that then it disappears over time? A few generations later, you say the word Celt, and it has no meaning to many people on the scene. So those are the two stories, and it's a story of kind of racial instability, but also bedrock white supremacism. The reason, and you should just jump in with or stop me at any moment, but I'm just going to kind of roll for a second. The reason I go back to 1790. That was the first time that the very first U.S. Congress sat down and tried to decide who was eligible for naturalized citizenship, who could come to the new nation and become a citizen. And the key phrase of that legislation was free white persons. And that was a phrase that stayed on the books until the 1950s, until 1952. Now, it was amended twice. African nativity and descent was added after the Civil War, and the Chinese as a group were added during World War II because China was an ally. So for political reasons, they were added to naturalization law. But but other than that, the phrase free white persons was the key phrase that was really defining American citizenship law for upwards of 160 years. So how is it that happens? One of the things that's interesting about that debate in the first Congress is that they debated everything. They debated how long you had to be in the country. They debated whether Catholics and Jews should be eligible. They debated whether people who hold titles of nobility in other countries should be eligible. They wondered about people who were property holders in other countries. They debated this law every which way, upside down and backwards, for a good part of a day. But the question they never asked was about the Free White Persons Clause. That just slipped kind of unconsciously into law. And it did so really in two ways, or for two reasons. One was the kind of practical reason that had been operative in race and racialized relations even in the colonial period, and that was that this was really a settler democracy. This wasn't a democracy pure and simple that was being set up. It was a settler democracy and a slaveholding democracy, and also a democracy that depended on territorial wars with the native nations. Now, in that context, notions, really core notions like domestic tranquility itself are already racialized notions. And sure enough, in colonial statutory law, there's all kind of precedent for the use of the word white in defining who can bear arms, who can participate in militias, and so forth. So there's a long kind of practical history of white supremacism in which the ever-present threat of slave rebellion on the one hand and the fairly continuous Indian wars on the other were already kind of racializing and defining the acceptable polity as a white one. The other reason... Okay.
I wanted to hop in there just to clarify for our listeners. And throughout the program, I might ask if you could lower your vocabulary level.
Okay.
My partner in attempting to counter racism, white supremacy, Justice, is 10. She is not with us at the moment, but if she was here, she would be requesting lower vocabulary level. That would help our listeners. I just want to make sure I'm accurately summarizing what you just said to make sure our listeners didn't miss anything in terms of this book, Whiteness of a Different Color. If I was going to sum that up, would you say it's accurate to say that your work, you attempted in this book to show that the system of white supremacy is fundamental to studying, understanding any period of time in the area of the world known as the United States, and that the so-called white race, I'm putting that in quotes, so-called white race has been unstable and revised and contested throughout the history of this area of the world, and that white supremacy, specifically the abuse of unambiguously non-white people, has been a cohesive and unifying catalyst for the so-called white race. Do you think that would be an accurate summary of what you talk about in Whiteness of a Different Color? Yes,
it is. And what I try to do in the work is break it down into different stages and kind of trace it historically and look at over time, how does this work? Who are the in-groups and who are the out-groups? And if you look at the groups now, like Jews, for example, or Armenians or Italians, who seem pretty solidly to be numbered now among the white population, how do you understand those moments in which their racial position was at least on the margins or the borders or maybe fully outside of whiteness as it was properly understood, and how do we understand how those processes work, how people's racial identity or how groups' racial identity actually changes over time?
Outstanding. I can pick at pretty much at this point. I've done enough programs where if I'm going to be talking to someone who's written a book, I can pretty much tell by the language that they use in their book if they're going to be very honest and open about discussing white supremacy. Your book, I anticipated you were going to have a lot of constructive information because you use the term non-white and you use the term white supremacy consistently in your book, and that is pretty uncommon amongst all the people that I've had on the program. Most people do not use those two terms consistently, and I think people that use those terms, I think, have much more accurate information, and they're much clearer when they speak about racism, white supremacy. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things, here's what's important about it to me, and here's what's at stake in the discussion. And one of the reasons why I don't shy away from those kinds of words. And this gets actually back to where I was a minute ago. In 1790, I mean, one of the things that I discovered in looking at that moment so many years ago, it seems like a long time ago, right? One of the things I discovered was that at that moment, at the creation of the new republic, that democracy itself was seen to be, by the founders, now I'm talking about the white founders, was seen to be such a fragile political experiment that as far as they were concerned, its success depended on the exclusion of certain people. And for that generation of Europeans and Euro-Americans in the late 18th century, race provided one of the keys by which such decisions could be made. And that's one of the ways that race ends up being so central to the political system and culture that they invented. So it's not just a story about slavery, although slavery is one of the more glaring contradictions or seeming contradictions in the country that they formed. But that's only one of many examples. You can look at all other kinds of exclusions from rights, exclusions from voting, exclusions from property holding or testifying in court. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that people of color were written out of that original democracy. And one of the things that suggests is that while in grade school we're taught to think of democracy as really the big game in town and the big kind of contribution that this country made to world politics and world history, we're supposed to think that that's the main thing, and then there's this little blot over on the side somewhere on the periphery, this little blot called racism, and it's very unfortunate, and it needs to be fixed, it needs to be rooted out, but it's really not part of the main game at all. And what my own studies suggested to me is that, in fact, racism and democracy are one and the same in this country. They aren't necessarily so, but in this country and in its history, they have been. They're kind of joined at the hip, as it were. They're part of the same creature. And at that originary moment in 1790, racism wasn't contradictory to American democracy. It was seen as the thing that was going to guarantee it. And I think that is the reason that racism has been so difficult to root out over the ensuing hundreds of years. That racism is so central to the political culture that we have to be, we have to give it name. We have to name it wherever we see it, because otherwise we don't stand a chance of rooting it out.
Again, Yale's Dr. Matthew Jacobson, our guest today, Context of White Supremacy. One thing, again, I think it's very important, clarity in discussions of racism. My view, I do not connect the term racism or white supremacy with democracy. I know a lot of people have very different definitions for what democracy means. My view, democracy would be a system of justice where no one is being mistreated. Racism guarantees is all about mistreating people on the basis of color. So I think it would be more accurate, as opposed to saying that democracy and racism are connected. I think it would be more accurate to say that the game is not democracy in this area of the world. The game, and really worldwide, the game is racism, white supremacy. Do you think that is correct?
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. Let's see, what's the way to put this? I didn't mean that actual democracy depends on racism. I quite agree with you. I would say the opposite, that actual democracy requires anti-racism. But what I meant was that the democracy that we have, the so-called democracy that we've ended up with as the central political culture in this political setting, the reason that the struggle has been ongoing and that the workings of democracy have had to be fought over, every single generation, is that for that founding generation, their version of democracy, which was very narrow and very exclusive, was built. It's kind of an amazing thing that they cast so many of the founding documents of the country in a truly universal language, because their intent was not at all universal. Their intent was very narrow, and it was very much based on a kind of white supremacist vision.
Excuse me. Thank you for clarifying. I greatly appreciate that. Excuse me. I wanted to ask, because I feel like in Whiteness of a Different Color, you give tons of examples, real life, just an analysis of everything from court documents, books, films, just piling on the evidence, which I greatly appreciate. Makes it very thorough in reading your book. You talk about being accepted as a white person in this area of the world and in the system of white supremacy. Being accepted as a white person means practicing racism, white supremacy. I wouldn't even know where to begin in terms of pulling examples where you cite this in your book. Can you share with our listeners how exactly that works and why you think that's true?
Well, I think that, let's see, well, this will connect with your conversation with Professor Honey Lopez a couple weeks ago. I mean, his work really looks at the legal dimensions of this in a way that my work tries to take on other dimensions, but I think we're very much seeing the same thing. That is, as the original game, as it was kind of laid out, required a pattern of kind of letting people in or keeping people out of the idealized notion of we the people, right? There's we the people, and there are groups that are included from that and groups that are excluded, largely on the basis of race. And one of the things that you see over time is, rather than that premise, that basic premise, being challenged, and people saying, wait a minute, why do I have to be white to be among we the people? I mean, there are people who are questioning that. People like W.E.B. Du Bois and myriad others. But what you also see is a lot of people accepting the premise and just saying, okay, you may be right that you have to be white to be a full participant in this society. Your mistake is in assuming that I'm not white. I actually am white. And so you see, you see a lot of these European groups that I was looking at, making that claim in the late 19th century, ultimately with success. You see other groups like Middle Eastern groups or South Asians or even East Asians making same kind of claims with less spectacular success, but with some successes here and there. So there are just a number of court cases in particular, but you can also see it in just in journalism and in stories and even in political cartoons. You can see the ways that racial categories are being fought over, and the boundaries are being fought over and actually moved over time, so that someone might come to court and say, yes, well, you say I'm not white because I'm Japanese, but actually, look at the color of my skin, listen to my language, look at my education. I'm certainly as white as any white person you can name. So that was a claimant who came to court petitioning in the early 1920s named Takeo Ozawa, who was a completely assimilated Japanese immigrant, he lost his case. But nonetheless, he's one of many, many, many people who you see who's accepting the basic premise that whiteness should be a prerequisite or one of the necessary pieces of political identity in this country. He's accepting the premise, but he's just challenging where the courts have drawn the boundaries, and you see that again and again and again.
Definitely. I see that a lot in your book where different people, be it Mr. Ozawa or Mr. Thind, or even people who ostensibly are working against racism, that what they end up doing is not arguing against racism, white supremacy. What they end up arguing is that I should not be mistreated because I am a white person. Mm-hmm. But I did want to make sure that I did look at specifically the many examples that you cite in your book where being a white person is regarded as being an individual who practices racism, white supremacy. Both, I'm looking at page 15 in your book, first chapter, you talk about Hugh Henry Brackenridge's 1792 book, Modern Chivalry, where one of his characters, Mr. O'Regan, says that I believe that in killing the savage, I have performed my duty as a man and served my country as a citizen. This is one of many examples where being a white person and being a citizen is equated with mistreating a non-white person. It pops up again here on page 25. In practice, the idea of citizenship had become thoroughly entwined with the idea of whiteness, because what a citizen really was at bottom was someone who could help put down a slave rebellion or participate in Indian wars. That sounds like someone who can participate in the system of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. If you could elaborate for our listeners, or if you could pull out some of the many other examples that you cite in your book, that would be fabulous.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you see then is the phrase free white persons is on the books as the thing that's going to regulate immigration and allow groups to become citizens. Now, the people who penned that law in 1790, Brackenridge's contemporaries, never ever dreamed of the millions and millions of people, and not just from Europe, but from all over Europe, including the east and the south of Europe, who are going to come under that umbrella of free white persons. I mean, that's one of the striking things now, from the vantage point of 2009, the phrase free white persons as defining who can become a citizen seems so incredibly narrow, which it has become, indeed. I mean, the law has changed, and our views have changed, and to some extent our structures have changed, but not fully. But at the time, that was an incredibly generous umbrella, a huge umbrella, and it allowed all kinds of people to come who the framers weren't exactly thinking of as being the free white persons they had in mind. So the first kind of crisis in this system comes in the 1840s when the Irish become the first non-Anglo-Saxon or kind of non-English group to come in enormous numbers, and then they're followed by all kinds of other groups from South and East Europe: Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavians, Russian Jews, all kinds of people who were not envisioned by the framers. Now, all of these people do come in under the umbrella of free white persons, and I don't want to confuse that issue. They were never non-white. They were always white according to law. But during that period, in the second half of the 19th century, they, despite their whiteness, their legal whiteness, they were perceived as being so different from the old Anglo-Saxon kind of cultural center of the young nation that they became a kind of outcast groups, but more than that, became outcast groups in racial terms. So it's in that period where you see race is kind of race becomes the instrument for managing this crisis, the crisis of immigration. On the one hand, you have a capitalist system and an economic order that seems to be demanding as many people as possible come to staff the industrializing country and to take stewardship over the wheels of industry, at least as unskilled or semi-skilled laborers. You have an economy that wants the 26 million people to enter the country between the Civil War and World War I, but you still have that the political culture itself, the democracy, who the old kind of elite types still see as a fragile experiment that all of these millions of people are not fit for. And fitness for self-government, that's a phrase, you don't hear it much anymore. You haven't heard it since around the beginning of the 20th century. But that's a phrase you heard all the time. It was in political speeches and in newspapers and in editorials. Fitness for self-government was one of the things that people talked about in thinking about who should be let in and who should not. And race, again, became the kind of key for thinking about that. So it's in that setting where Hebrews or Slavs or Celts are seen as a political threat to the Republic that you start to see them being discussed in racial terms. And by racial, I mean the kind of hereditary, immutable terms that are implied when we talk about race. And we now know that race is a fiction of sorts. It's a socially kind of an unconscious fiction. We experience race as real. We look at each other and we kind of think we see something of the natural order in each other's faces. But as historians and geneticists and sociologists and legal scholars have been finding over the last 30 or 40 years, the closer you get to kind of pinpointing what race is, the more you become aware of how fictitious it is and how changeable it is and how mutable it is. It's changing all the time. It's very fluid. It's not solid at all. So one of the things that you see in this period between the arrival of the Irish and about the 1920s is this very fluid period where suddenly there's not just one white race, although legally there's one white race, but in kind of popular understanding there are about 37 white races, and they're arranged in a really unforgiving kind of hierarchical order, with Anglo-Saxons at the top and the darker white people, if you will, people like Italians and Jews and Armenians at the bottom. And that is a system of racial understanding that emerges in response to a very particular crisis in the culture, and it's a racial understanding that then will disappear at the same moment that crisis is no longer the most salient or important crisis that people are seeing.
Again, Dr. Matthew Jacobson, professor at Yale. I wanted to not exactly switching gears, because this is pretty much all about racism, white supremacy. So, because I want to point out some of the specific examples. The term you use in your book, probationary whites, for some of these people who are not quite all the way accepted on the white team, and maybe even there's some disagreement about whether they are actually on the white team, so-called Irish people who immigrated here, and Italians, Slavs, so on and so forth. I want to pick out some of the specific examples, particularly your analysis of the jazz singer and Al Jolson's performance. I really want to get to that, but I wanted to address specifically really getting some clarity about the system of white supremacy. You do deal, as does Professor Lopez, you do spend a nice chunk of time talking about white people who decided whether or not these so-called Irish people, or whether it's specific individuals, Mr. Ozawa, Thind, in different court cases where individuals went to court to petition that they were indeed white people. I think it's very important that non-white people especially get an understanding that the most powerful white people in a system of white supremacy, they get to decide who is a white person, who is a non-white person.
That's right.
As you just said, the terms race and really all of these terms, white, black, really the way you start your book, very funny, but I mean it really, really puts out there how much nonsense all this is when you really start analyzing it. What do these terms really mean? What does it really mean to be a white person? What does it really mean to be a black person? All of this stuff at the end of the day can really be boiled down to it means whatever the most powerful white people say it means.
That's
that
right.
goes for black, that goes for white, that goes for any of these other terms that want to be floated out. If you could help non-white people grasp that, because you do spend a nice amount of time talking it in your work, that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, one of the things that that was so striking to me in this work is I started seeing, and I was, historians had been kind of overlooking this for a long time. References to, the Jewish race or the Irish race or the Scandinavian race or whatever in these, old newspapers or whatever from the 1870s, 1880s, and what the impulse had always been to say, oh, they don't really mean race. They mean something else. They mean ethnicity. They mean ethnic group. They don't mean race. And it just, the more I looked at these sources and the more I thought about it, the more I started to ask, well, what happens if you start to assume that they really did mean race, that they're not talking about ethnicity the way we do, which is, a matter of kind of culture and language and who you associate with and that kind of thing. But they really are talking about race. They're talking about biology. They're talking about blood. They're talking about skin color and the texture of hair. They're talking about all these things that we associate with race. And, going the next kind of racial or racist step, not just to notice physical features, but then to assume all kinds of character traits to go along with those and to be unchanging kind of character traits of a people. I said, so what happens when you start to look at the 19th century sources with that eye is you realize that, yes, they really did mean race when they were talking about Hebrews. They really did mean race when they were talking about Celts or Slavs. And some of the different places that I started to see it, once I was accepting that was the case, that what we are seeing is not just an outmoded usage of the word race, but what we're seeing are outmoded racial categories that no longer have any significance or importance to us. Once I started to look at it that way, everything started to look different, and then your mind opens up and you start to see the way race is operating. So you see things like there was a famous or infamous, or I don't know, legal case in which a fellow named Rollins, an African-American man who was charged with the crime, which it was at that time, the crime of associating with a white woman. And he's found not guilty because the woman in question was Italian and therefore was not conclusively white. That is very powerful. When the courts are making those kinds of decisions and handing down those kinds of destabilizing kinds of notions about whiteness itself, but also about Italianness and where it fits in the grand scheme of things, then you know that you're seeing something really important, because it is, as you said, it is, I would say, the courts, the state generally, or government generally. That includes legislation, but it also includes, I would say, things like census taking. The Census Bureau is, I think, a really important actor in this story. Then there's the education system, the sciences, and all of those disciplines who, in the 19th century and onward, really started focusing on race, and all of those disciplines for which race became so important in the construction of knowledge, or what we might call so-called knowledge. These are the chief actors in race making, I would say.
I didn't say that. I just wanted to be very clear. I was very specific in saying the most powerful white people. Mm-hmm. They are the ones who get to decide, right. Is this individual a white person? Is this individual an Italian? Is this a black person? They're the ones at the end of the day who are going to be looking at Mr. Ozawa and saying, no, you're not a white person. Sorry, you're not a citizen.
That's right. Yeah, so that's where it becomes, it's not just an individual history. It's not just Theodore Roosevelt and his quirky ideas about race, but it's all of the institutions that he engages, and that's where things like the courts, the education system, are so important to this story. And in fact, you can't understand the workings of race and racism without understanding those kinds of institutional players in the game.
Bold print that, underline that. When Professor Lopez was on the program, and I said that I felt his book was incredible, and I do. I really think these two programs should probably be sequenced. When Professor Lopez was here, I told him his book was an incredible study in white supremacy, and he said, well, my book is not about white supremacy. And I said, well, it's an analysis of court cases that decide who gets to be white, who's not white. And he said, yeah, that's an indispensable part of white supremacy. And I said, okay, then, so I'm going to go back to what I said. This is incredibly important in understanding white supremacy, and really, and I think your book as well, in understanding how who gets to be white has changed so dramatically, and really, especially when you start looking at how and what caused these groups, these probationary white people, to be included fully on the white team. Often it was mistreating the unambiguously non-white people.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, one of the real educations I had in the process of kind of working all this out and trying to understand what it meant was the moment, and there's a chapter in the book called 1877 that just shows all of the different kind of contradictory ways that race was in operation at a given moment. And I picked the year 1877 for a number of reasons. I mean, there was just a lot going on in the country right then, both, I mean, in the South, in the far West, in the urban North. I mean, there were all kinds of conflicts taking place that you saw being discussed in racial terms, and so it seemed like a good moment to focus on, although you could probably focus on any moment and try to make the same case. But one of the things that I realized in working on that was that at that moment, the Irish represented the real kind of peril to the Republic, or the kind of perceived racial peril to the Republic, if you were in a city like Boston. But that meanwhile, out west in a city like San Francisco, it was the Irish who were leading the charge in the kind of anti-Chinese agitation. And once I realized that those two things were taking place at the same time, that changed a lot of things in my thinking. Are you still there? I think I lost you for a minute there. Can you hear me now?
Oh, okay. We're good. Yeah. Probably some interference to be expected in the system of white supremacy.
Exactly right.
I mean, it happens all the time now. I don't even get upset about it anymore. What I did notice with your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I really spend a lot of time, and you've already mentioned it, this outstanding. I spend a lot of my time investigating the 8th area of people activity, sexual intercourse, in the system of white supremacy. The time I've been studying this, I feel that is really one of the fundamental issues in the system of white supremacy, sexual intercourse between non-white people and white people. I have a photograph on my show page with a non-white person holding it's a black male holding a white female in a sexual position. I harp on that all the time, and people say that I'm acting crazy and blah, blah, blah. I think the people who say that do not have a clear understanding of racism, white supremacy, and from now on, I'm going to hold up your book and say I could have simply talked about every chapter of your book and focused everything on sexual intercourse between white people and non-white people, and we could have walked through every chapter of your book. Whether it's, you already mentioned, the court case with Mr. Rollins, whether it's Black No More, whether it's talking about communism, and I thought of Richard Wright's book with Native Son, whether it's the 1863 riots in New York with the Irish, even the terms mongrelization,
right,
assimilation, amalgamation, eugenics. They even broke down, you have admitted racists in your book breaking down fertility statistics between so-called Jews and other Jews, and if it's a Jewish person married to a white person, and showing that you have higher infertility rates if it's a Jewish person and a white person. So they shouldn't be intermarrying. This was back when there was some confusion and disagreement about whether Jews were really on the white team. Just I couldn't even write them all down if I wanted to. Just all the incidents of where the Scottsboro Boys case. Do you think, just based on your book, Whiteness of a Different Color, do you think control of the sexual conduct of white people and non-white people is really one of the fundamental goals of the system of white supremacy?
I don't know if I would say goal, but I do think it's one of the central components. And historically for a lot of different reasons. One is that sexuality really determined property in the slaveholding South for generations and generations. Who could own property and who could be property, was determined by, by reproduction, basically. But also, so that's one really heavy part of the history that weighs on this. Another, though, is it's really by reproductive practices and customs that groups either do or don't remain groups, as long as physicality or race, whether you want to call it blood or genes or physiognomy or whatever the term is, as long as you're ascribing identity to in a meaningful way to one's physical being, as long as you're looking at the body and making judgments about who's who, then reproduction is key in terms of groups either continuing or not.
Hold on, wait a minute. Because I get to be real rowdy today because I read your book thoroughly and took notes on it, so I'm going to use your book to evidence exactly what I'm saying. Now, I'm not going to back down from my statement. I said control of sexual conduct of white people and non-white people is fundamental in the system of white supremacy. Now, what you just said was if you're going to have any sort of system that is about the identities and physical features of people, sex is going to be key. Do you think the system of racism, white supremacy, is dependent upon physical features and how people look?
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
Oh, wait a minute. I didn't get a yes or no.
Let me think about this for a second.
Okay.
Because, it's like Dick Gregory used to say. He said you could take all of the white people away from the levers of the system, but if you don't really alter the system, you're still going to have a racist system, and it doesn't matter if the people at the levers are black or Asian or Latino or what. You have to alter the system, and I think that. So I'm just kind of pausing over your question because I think that it's too easy an answer to suppose that that interracial sex over many generations is going to solve this thing.
Oh, no, I never said that.
Okay.
I never said that. All I'm saying is that the white people who practice and maintain the system of white supremacy, one of their fundamental objectives, in my view, I think it could be one of the primary objectives, is to maintain control over the sexual conduct of white people and non-white people. I'm not saying so-called
I don't think you and I disagree. I guess I'm quibbling over words like goal and objective. One of the other ways that you could take the central premise of what you're saying and agree with it, but say, well, what if it's not an objective in itself? What if that's just a means to an other end? What if sex and sexuality and reproduction are the ways that we can really control things like property rights? Then it's no longer an objective, but it's still absolutely as central. Do you see what I'm saying?
For sure. I totally agree with what you just said. A myriad of things happens as a result of sexual intercourse. That is really underlying a lot of the anti-miscegenation laws that they had, and they've had these worldwide. This discussion doesn't even have to stop here. They have those in Australia and other parts of the world as well in controlling the sexual conduct of white people and non-white people. And yes, I mean, marriage, lots of things happen like that. Property changes hand once you have marriage, and diseases spread, and, I mean, everything. You have economics. I mean, every area of people activity is affected by sexual intercourse. You have more people, population. I mean, that's a huge one. If you can get control of that sex thing, you might get control of everything else. I'm saying, and I would use your book. I would even go this far. Are you familiar with Dr. Frances Cress Welsing?
No, huh?
She is a non-white person. She admitted she is a victim of white supremacy. She has written a book called The ISIS Papers. It's all about racism, white supremacy. Her theory, and she says she could be incorrect, but her theory is that the system of white supremacy at its root is driven by the people who classify themselves as white having a fear that if they have too much sexual intercourse with the people that they say are not white, they will eventually no longer be people who are light enough to be classified as white. She terms that white genetic annihilation. I would grab your book and say this supports her theory wholeheartedly, because you've already talked about how the probationary whites, they had a hierarchy where the darker you get, and there's more question, more suspicion about whether or not you get to be on the white team. And then the darker you go, there's no question at all. Once you're a Negro or a so-called Asian person, there's no more question at all. Now it's, oh, you're for sure not a white person. You're someone that's going to be mistreated forever, as long as we have the system of white supremacy. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'll have to look at her book. It's very interesting, and certainly that's an argument. I mean, George Schuyler was arguing similar things in White No More, or Black No More, I'm sorry. I can't comment on her book, but I do think it's a really interesting argument.
Again, I would point out everyone that is, and she's been on this program as well, everyone who's listening, if they are familiar with her work, if you've read her, if they've read her book, or if you heard her when she was on this program, I would encourage you, read Dr. Jacobson's book and see if you think it supports her argument wholeheartedly. As again, you've already talked about the gradations of color just on the so-called white team. And your book, I mean, sex is all over the place in this book. And white people being upset and wanting to guard against having too many non-white people who could potentially have sex with white people and mess things up. The Johnson Act and seeking to keep out non-white people or probationary whites who might come here and mess things up, who might be feeble-minded or just don't measure up to the Anglo-Saxon standard that we have set here. I just want to make sure that we have clarity on my statement, my view that the system of white supremacy, one of its fundamental have-to-dos is maintaining control of sexual intercourse between white people or non-white people. I wanted to be clear if you felt that was correct.
Yeah, no, well, certainly, it's, as I said, I see it as one of the central components. And yeah, so I mean, I don't think you and I are very far apart on that question. I'm curious, though, now, what you would say is portended by, we talked about the Census Bureau a little while ago. The 2000 census was the first time that that people participating in the census were not just allowed, but actually kind of encouraged to feel free to check more than one box if they were multiracial. And now that seems I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's too early to tell exactly what that means. To me, though, it seems to me that something very deep is going on in the culture, and that's one symptom of it. I would say that the election of Barack Obama is another. That I know I am not at all going to try to argue that we're licking white supremacy or that we're beating it or that it's going to go away anytime soon. But I do think that we're seeing some fundamental shifts in the political culture that require our attention and whatever explanation we can give it. So, I mean, how do you understand some of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years?
Excuse me. Well, with regards to the census, you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask you about that.
Okay.
Turn the table, which is no problem.
Uh-huh.
With regards to the classifications and people, you said you feel or it seems that perhaps people are being encouraged to check more than one box. My view on that is very similar to your view in the last chapter of your book where you talked about different so-called liberal white people, when they would ostensibly be working against racism, would end up reifying and supporting whiteness, racism, white supremacy in their work. That is exactly what I see in encouraging, and I would agree, I see the same thing, people being encouraged, non-white people being encouraged to check multiple boxes as though that is somehow working against the system of white supremacy. I have no idea how if I decide, well, I think I have a grandmother who's so-called Asian, and I think I have an uncle who is so-called Native American, and I don't want to ignore that part of my heritage and my history, so I'm going to check all three of those boxes. I have no idea what that does to replace white supremacy with justice. In my view, that sort of thing causes confusion amongst non-white people who don't really have an understanding of the fact that we are in a system of white supremacy. And so they'll say, oh, okay, we're going to check these boxes now. This is great. We're working against race. And I've seen that. I've heard this from people, particularly individuals who have a white parent and a non-white parent. They get it hook, line, and sinker. They have a total confusion about racism, white supremacy, because they will say, I'm white and I'm non-white.
Right.
And the people, the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, they check one box, white. All that other stuff, whatever. And I've had an admitted racist come on this program, Farrah Winfrey. She was here on April Fool's Day. One thing she said that was no joke. I don't care what box you check. If you don't check that white box, you are someone I can mistreat. I don't care if you check 20 boxes, 5 boxes, 3 boxes. Unless that white box is the only one checked, you are someone I am encouraged to mistreat or someone I shouldn't care if you're mistreated because you're not white. That would be my response to one.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I think certainly that's how the system has worked, over hundreds of years. And so, I mean, I think some of these at the cultural level, and for many people at the personal level, these are not simple questions at all. But I think that the overall tendencies of white supremacism in the culture, there's a sociologist at Duke who argues that, well, the white-black divide has really been the deepest and the most significant in this country over time, that what we're going to end up with now as we enter this new era, the kind of post-Obama era, is not a post-racial era at all, but an era of maybe a 3-part scheme. There's still white at the top, and then there's almost but not quite white in the middle, and then there's very dark at the bottom. But you're still going to end up with a hierarchy that's built on color. Yeah.
White supremacy. That's what I mean. That's why I said I like people like you, some of the other, Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly, who use non-white. When you start throwing in, and this is why I said those categories and checking multiple boxes, that's just going to add to the confusion, because now you'll have 20,000 different categories and people saying that they're white and non-white, and just a lot of confusion. What we have is a system of white supremacy. We should just use terms that as accurately as possible call attention to that. With President Obama, back to the sex thing. He has a white parent, non-white parent, and that played out huge in his election. I think, again, confusion for non-white people. I heard John Lewis, victim of white supremacy, non-white person, unless I'm mistaken. He said white supremacy is dead. Now, I could be wrong. I don't see any evidence that the system of white supremacy ended with the election of President Obama. I hear tons of non-white people and white people that I suspect are racist saying, what are you talking about, system of racism? We've got a black person in the White House, which is interesting.
That's one of the, I see this as a very hopeful but also a very dangerous moment that we're in, and that is certainly one of the dangers, that the election, that it would be a token, kind of a token role in the purest sense, that his presence in the White House would allow too many people just to kind of wipe the whole thing away and say, this is, racism is a thing of the past, and it's something that needn't claim our attention anymore. And I think, certainly we can look around and see evidence to the contrary. We can see how alive and kicking white supremacism is. But I do think that there's a danger at this moment that certain people are going to find some traction for the argument that we've beat it once and for all, and Obama is proof of that, and now let's turn our attention away from race and racial stratification.
I think racist white supremacists would gain a lot of traction with that this problem is gone, there's no more racism, let's continue, and we can get back to practicing racism, white supremacy, and the victims don't even think it exists anymore. I did want to switch back to, because I had questions for you.
Okay.
For sure, Dr. Matthew Jacobson, author of Whiteness of a Different Color. I've already been using the term. I want to make sure our listeners are clear. The individuals that you talk about in your book, so-called Jews and so-called Irish people, different immigrants from the area of the world known as Europe, you reference them as probationary whites. I think we've explained it, but just to make sure, can you explain why you use that term probationary whites in your book?
Okay. Well, because when they entered this country in numbers great enough to really capture people's attention, by people I mean the kind of elites, mostly Anglo-Saxon, the so-called old stock elites, who up until the arrival of these immigrant groups really were controlling cities, states, governments, the courts, most industries. They were really in control of everything. They entered this country at a moment that created a lot of anxiety among elites, and the elites fought back with a kind of racist language about who these people were, where they came from, what they deserved, what they were capable of, what they weren't capable of, what they didn't deserve. There were all these narratives and stories and images, negative, attached to these people's identity and cast in racial terms. So they were white in that they were legally white and could come into the country as and become citizens and go through the naturalization process. So they were white, but they were probationary in the sense that they did not have anything like the standing of the good old Anglo-Saxon old stock. And it was going to take them a while to either prove themselves or something was going to have to change before they became simply white in the American scheme of things. And ultimately that did happen. Ultimately the 19th century's Celts and Slavs and Hebrews did become the 20th century's Caucasians, and I think that there are a number of explanations for that. One is the really powerful legislation against immigration that passed in the 1920s, and that was cast very much in these racial terms of the superior and inferior races of Europe, and formulas were devised quite self-consciously by Congress to assure that the people from the wrong parts of Europe their rates of immigration slowed almost to a trickle after the 1924 Act. So and I think that partial resolution of the so-called crisis of immigration was one of the things that would allow those who already came in to kind of solidify their status as whites. But I think in some ways the more important story is politically and culturally what it meant when huge numbers of African Americans migrated from the rural and to a lesser extent the urban South to the northern cities and Midwestern cities, Boston, Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, exactly the cities where the problematic racial types from Europe had settled in such great numbers. And the new kind of invigorated black presence in these cities completely altered the alchemy, and I use alchemy quite self-consciously as a term to describe the changeability of race. The African-American migration really changed the political alchemy of the race politics of cities like Boston and New York, and suddenly the conflict between Anglo-Saxon and Celt or Anglo-Saxon and Hebrew wasn't nearly as important or as consuming in the national consciousness as the conflict or contests at the local level between the newly arrived African Americans in the North and whites, simply understood or increasingly understood just as whites. And the African American presence in the North, beginning most significantly around World War I and after, but then continuing through the 20th century, that really altered the alchemy of race thinking in this country, and subsequently it really altered the status of those probationary white groups who up to that point had not quite been fully white, but were soon to become so. There's a sense in which, ironically, and I mean it is ironic that some of, I won't say the only first, but some of the first beneficiaries of the great African American migration weren't African Americans at all. They were those pariah white races of the North whose fortunes suddenly rose based on the presence of African Americans in their midst.
Outstanding illustration of how for sure, no ambiguity here, non-white people, black people, lowest, helped galvanize and unify the white club. I thought this was fascinating. I really want to make sure we share this with our listeners. Two fabulous points that you make in your book, and how these different probationary whites became full-fledged members of the white team. One, you analyzed the 1863 riots in New York, where the so-called Irish people, very upset about the drafts for the Civil War, ended up rioting and had a very explicitly racial tinge to it. The other example, you examine the film, The Jazz Singer, where Al Jolson, who is infamous, or famous for doing a lot of blackface in early 20th century films. You specifically look at The Jazz Singer, where he is a so-called Jewish person doing this blackface, and you talk about how the act of him participating in blackface removes him from probationary white status and actually wins him to the white team. Could you talk about those two specific examples, please?
Sure. Well, the draft riots in 1863 are really complex. I mean, first of all, these are riots on the part of mostly Irish, not exclusively, but mostly Irish citizens in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia. The worst of the riots were in New York, but who are, first of all, not necessarily sympathetic with the Northern cause in the Civil War, don't necessarily feel that they have any gripes against the Southern aristocrats, and are not necessarily ready to go to war for the cause of the Union or of anti-slavery, either one. They also have a real gripe with the elites among the North who have found various ways of running the war, but not necessarily fighting in it. So Irish working class people kind of take to the streets and they're protesting the war. They're protesting their inscription in it, but they're doing this through a kind of enactment of violent whiteness. I mean, a lot of these riots were just violent attacks on various peoples of color. And so one of the things that you get in the commentary, this is 1863, you get the elites looking out their windows at the rioters and talking about these Celtic savages who are running through the streets. And then meanwhile, you get the Celts themselves kind of enacting a kind of white supremacism. And so, I mean, it's a moment that is full of violence and pain and tragedy, but it's also a moment that gives you a glimpse, kind of in a historical way, of the ways that these categories are always in motion, and what do the categories Celtic on the one hand and white on the other mean in 1863. And you can look at the draft riots and you can see the categories in motion, but you can also begin to understand what's at stake in such a question when you look at the racial terms that are used both by the elites who are denigrating the Irish and the Irish themselves who are trying to lay claim to plain and simple whiteness by carrying out attacks on people who they perceive as being non-whites. The other moment, now, blackface minstrelsy was the most popular cultural form in the United States, really beginning as far back as the 1840s. And this is, there were black performers who did this too, by the way, but for the most part we're talking about white performers, and often immigrant performers from the very groups that we're talking about. The Irish in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. A little bit later on, you get immigrant groups from other parts of Europe, and ultimately people like Al Jolson, who was a Jewish immigrant, putting burnt cork on their faces and enacting blackness in a way that historians have talked about in all kinds of ways. That, what is the meaning of this? What does it mean to dress up like a black person in the context of this racist culture, and kind of bring it on oneself and embody it and play with it, as it were. What does that mean? What's the meaning of that? And one of the things that I argue is that one of the meanings is, and I think that there are a lot of things going on there, but one of the things that's going on is that it is an ironic way of laying claim to whiteness. And what I say about Jolson is that he actually kind of erases his identity as a Hebrew the minute he puts on the blackface. And once the face is blackened up, you don't see a Jewish immigrant anymore. All you see is white and black. You see a white person being covered up by black makeup, and in a weird way, it establishes the whiteness of the immigrant. And I think that that's one of the things that minstrelsy, as a cultural form or a cultural practice, was accomplishing for these white performers over the decades. Now, Jolson himself is a really complicated figure because I feel pretty comfortable in that interpretation of mine. I feel like that's one of the things that the jazz singer does, is it does lay claim to whiteness on behalf of the Hebrews. But the other thing about Jolson was that a lot of his personal politics were strictly anti-racist. For example, there was a well-known convention at the time of when you made a film in Hollywood, and if you included black people, Southern distributors would just cut the film so that all the blacks were taken out of it, and then they would show it as a whites-only film. And that was pretty common practice in early film in the South. Now, Jolson purposely cut his films. I don't think the jazz singer is in this category because I don't think there are any black entertainers in the jazz singer. But in other films that he made, when he not only included African American actors, but he made sure that the film was shot in such a way that if you tried to cut out the black actors, you would have to cut him out entirely also. And that was a really kind of far-thinking and progressive act on his part. So now what do you make of this contradiction? I don't know. I mean, I think it says something about, I guess I would say it goes back to what we talked about early on when we were talking about the question of intention. I mean, I think that there is some kind of racist mechanism in operation in a film like The Jazz Singer, but that doesn't simply mean that that someone like Jacobson is a racist. I think that story is a little bit more complicated. Although I hope that as you've seen from reading my work, that you know me as somebody who's not very quick to let people off the hook on that question.
For sure, and I'm not quite getting off the hook here because I'm listening and I'm thinking, wait a minute now, he just said that Mr. Jacobson is participating in racism, white supremacy, and that the entire act of blackface and minstrelsy is racism, white supremacy, which unless I'm incorrect, Mr. Jacobson is infamous for that. Mm-hmm. But because he would cut his films in such a way that you could not or couldn't easily cut the black people out of the films, that means he's not racist?
Well, I'm not saying that either. I'm saying I think that the line between intentionality and intentionality is a complicated one, and I don't know. And I personally don't know enough about Jacobson to say I can give you an answer that I'm comfortable with on that question. I'm interested though in keeping the contradiction before us for a little while because I think it's an important one.
For non-white people, I'm very much interested in alleviating confusion around that. And for me, I found the best way to alleviate confusion is to get clarity around definitions. And I define a racist white supremacist as a white person who mistreats someone or someones because they are not white. Do you think Mr. Jacobson participated in mistreating anyone because they were not white, even in his performance of blackface?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, I would say that he was certainly complicit in a set of practices and cultural forms that were racist. I'm comfortable with going that far. Does that make him? I mean, does that complicity? I mean, if you're saying that complicity is guilt, then yes, he's racist. That's pretty simple. If complicity, if there's a kind of spectrum that you want to break down and think about, first, and which is worth breaking down because a lot of alliances that have worked in this country have worked because some of those complicit racists have been able to be shaken loose from their views and moved to act politically in different ways. So I think it's worth making some distinctions when we're talking about racism, and it's worth making some distinctions when we're talking about racists. Where I think Jacobson ultimately lays on that spectrum, I'm not sure, but I think that the two things that we've been talking about, his blackface performance and his editing practices, I think make it a tough question.
As a victim of white supremacy, I do not have a spectrum for how I view white people, and I think that's a key discrepancy here. You as a white person, myself as a victim of white supremacy, probably have very different views on how we're going to be looking at this, although I do think we both seem to have agreement around the fact that we are in a system of white supremacy, and being a white person in a system of white supremacy means you participate in the system of white supremacy. We don't seem to have any disagreement there, so that's pretty much where my continuum ends. I did want to ask because, I would just pick your book up. Your book is great. I would pick your book up and say, no, I don't think white people are ignorant about racism, white supremacy. In fact, I don't think white people can be ignorant about racism.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, I should flesh out some of this, when we were talking about the African-American migration and how important that was to some of the white folks on the ground in cities like Boston, Chicago, New York. I mean, it's important that to note, too, that there are all kinds of things that go along with that story. Jim Crow union practices, hiring practices, housing practices, all kinds of things, banking and loans and redlining and all kinds of things that surely these people knew they were participating in. Surely they understood what it meant to participate in a Jim Crow union and to get all kinds of benefits as an employee because of that and because of the way the color line was being drawn in the 1920s and 1930s. So you're right. I mean, it's important not simply to let people cop out by saying, yeah, well, it was just the system and who knew and there was no intentionality. I'm not trying to paper that over in any way.
For sure. And you don't in your book. That's why I said your book is great. Listeners, if you're non-white especially, you should check his book out, Whiteness of a Different Color, because even in your book, you talk about, the book Lewis Sinclair's King's Blood Royal, where white character in this book, he finds out, for people who haven't read it, white character in this book, he finds out that he has, some great ancestor or what have you that is a black person. And so he's immediately like, oh my gosh, I'm not white anymore. He immediately, in no uncertain terms, understands the devastating ramifications of not being a white person in a system of white supremacy. That's what I mean when I say white people are in no way, shape, or form ignorant about racism, white supremacy. They know two things that are essential, and really these two things are all you need to know to consciously practice racism. Number one, I know how to pick out who is white and who is not white. You got to be able to do that as a white person in a system of white supremacy. And they know the relationship, the power relationship that is supposed to exist between white people and non-white people in a system of white supremacy. Every white person has got to know that in a system of white supremacy, and that's all you need to know to consciously practice racism. Do you think that's accurate?
Yes, I do.
Okay. As a white person in a system of white supremacy, do you practice racism, white supremacy?
That's a tough question. Well, I guess I must. One of the things I try to do with my privilege is do a kind of jujitsu move and use my privilege in furthering anti-racist politics. And I know that my position in the profession, my position at Yale, I mean, there are a lot of things. I have a pretty good platform, and I know that that's related in part to my structural advantage. I know that. I try to use it with responsibility and consciousness. That's all I can say.
I just wanted to be clear. So you did say yes, that you do practice racism, white supremacy as a white person?
Well, I don't think that you can escape it entirely. I mean, that's why as a white person, I think it's important to make some distinctions. I mean, I don't think in this political culture a white person can say, the question is not, and this is something I try to impress upon my students, the question is never, am I a racist? The question is, how am I a racist? And I think that because the system is so shot through with racial inclusions and exclusions and patterns of stratification, it's an impossible thing, or at least a very difficult thing to escape. And that's why I'm so suspicious. And this gets to the book that we were going to talk about on your show that we're not talking about. Roots 2 is really about the attempts in the post-civil rights years, the attempts on the part of many whites to disavow their whiteness, to say, I'm not really white, I'm Italian. I'm not really white, I'm Jewish. And they'll point back to the very history that you and I have been talking about tonight. They'll point back to that period when Hebrews and Italians and Celts were, in fact, kind of racial pariah groups on the scene. They'll point to that as proof that they are not white and do not participate in white privilege. Meanwhile, their status and their fortunes do rest on their grandparents having taken part in those Jim Crow unions and taken advantage of white over black banking and business practices, and moving to the suburbs in all-white neighborhoods and into to areas that were engineered to have property values not only stabilized but increased in certain ways. So they participated in all these ways, and yet they stand here in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, and kind of point back to the 19th century as proof that they are fresh off the boat. We're just immigrants, have no connection to slavery, have no connection to the Indian Wars, and therefore have no connection to white privilege or white supremacism. These are things from the ancient past that have nothing to do with my immigrant group. My grandparents just came here in the 1890s. So that's a book called Roots 2 that I really am trying to kind of call out the white disavowals of white privilege that we've seen in the wake of the civil rights movement.
Perhaps I should have done that one too. Maybe we'll get you back to do that one too. That was the one we were supposed to do for today. Gosh, I'm not upset. I'm not sad that I read this one. I thought this one was great. Maybe we'll read both of them. Everybody can go get all of Dr. Jacobson's stuff and learn about racism, white supremacy. I do want to pause to make sure we do not miss that point. You said, because it has been my experience that non-white people do not have the understanding of white supremacy that you do, and especially an Ivy League professor. Non-white people have a great lack of understanding, myself included, of how this system works, and I'm trying to work against that with this program. You said for white people, as long as the system of white supremacy exists, it's not a question of if you are racist. It is a question of how you practice racism. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Hope everybody is a non-white person. I hope you got that. I can't say that as a non-white person because people, get mad. White and non-white people get mad at me and say I'm saying things that are not true and all white people don't practice racism. It's been my experience that when white people say that, insert crickets. I'm going to ask one more question and then see if we can take a few questions before we wrap up. The number of folks, if you want to call in to ask Dr. Jacobson questions, is 347-215-6071. My one before I go for the phones. You talk about in your book, the KKK, sparingly, not a whole lot, but you talk about them and how they participated in mistreating non-white people. As I said, I had former Imperial Wizard of the KKK. He was actually on the program just before you. And he did not think we are currently in a system of white supremacy. He said that the KKK was established initially in response to the newly freed slaves, some of them, not all, but some of the newly freed slaves, taking out vengeance on white people, and the KKK was initially formed to protect white people from rowdy bands of black people in the South that were going around and harming their former slaveholders. Now, when he said this, I thought, I have never heard that before. I'm not sure that that's true. I didn't challenge him on it because I don't like getting into debates about things that happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that all we could both do is go point to a book and say, this book said so-and-so. He says, well, this book says so-and-so, and there we have a stalemate. Have you heard any of that? Because the only thing I can even think of that's close to that is Birth of a Nation, which I don't think anyone would look at and say, this is truthful documentary of history.
Apparently this fellow would. No, I mean, I think that it's a very comfortable mythology to say that the KKK and groups of other kind of vigilante and frankly terrorist groups in the White South did not come about simply for terrorist aims, but were actually an unfortunate response to a really horrible black over white situation. I mean, that is a really convenient mythology, but it doesn't match the facts. There are people much better qualified than I to recount that history for you, and I can give you their names. But I would just say quickly that closer to the truth is that that it really was the KKK and other groups like that arise fairly quickly after the end of the Civil War and the imposition of Reconstruction governments in the South, and they arise for one reason and one reason only, and that is not protection, but it's to overthrow the Northern rule and to terrorize the newly emancipated and now rights-holding black public, and that's what those groups were for. And they've emerged. They kind of ebbed and flowed over time, but always with some version of that aim somewhere in their stores.
Outstanding. That was one error I made on the program. After the program ended, I immediately felt like I should have called that out, but didn't feel like getting into a long historical debate. One error, my fault for the listeners, but there you go. Perhaps I'll bring him back on the show and we can spend the whole program talking about whether or not that's true. I'm going to go to the phone lines. We're going to take a quick commercial. Before we do that, if you could, because I told you I was going to give you an opportunity to speak more about Roots 2, because that was the book we were supposed to talk about. If you could take the next 60 seconds. If you have a watch in front of you, you can make it exactly 60 seconds. That would be great, to give us your best pitch to read Roots 2.
Okay. Well, one of the things that interested me about the period after the Civil Rights era is what happens on the white side of the color line. And what you see is after a couple of decades in which ethnic identities had really been fading away and had lost their importance to white people, suddenly they once again became very important. And part of this was an emulation of a successful kind of political strategy on the part of African Americans, but ironically it was turned in part, not entirely, but turned in part towards a kind of backlash politics. And so the argument increasingly heard in the 1970s and 80s and 90s is some version of the argument, I'm not simply white, I'm Jewish. I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm Greek. And it's not just at the personal level, but it really starts to run through the culture. Ellis Island becomes a kind of touchstone of American nationalism as a national park. Hollywood has this romance with the immigration story, beginning with Elia Kazan's America in the 1960s, and then running through 1,000 films up through Angela's Ashes and other more recent films. But the whole culture kind of reorients itself around the question of white identity in a way that has some progressive teeth to it, and some important progressive politics has emerged from that kind of ethnic argument. But to a large extent...
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
267, are you there?
Yes, what's up? I'm here.
Oh, right on. Greetings. This is Racism Not Anonymous, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
Go right ahead and ask your question, please, ma'am.
Okay. Let's see. So greetings to the good doctor, Jacobson.
Mm-hmm.
I have many questions. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Where do I begin? First, thank you, Brother Victim of Racism, for hosting the show and for having your guests and doing the work that you do. It is just simply, much needed work, I'll say. Let me just pick up on where we were last before we went to break, and I love the commercial, just for the record, I must say. But to Dr. Jacobson, I'm curious now, as you were given a description of Roots 2 and what the story details or chronicles, if you will, I'm sitting there wondering who's the audience, who's your intended audience for this book, and if it includes, for whom I call, as I refer to, people of African descent. Because I'm very specific in terms of the non-white group that I represent. If it is also intended for folks of African descent to read this information, for what purpose, towards what end? Because
what I'm trying to...
It will simply continue to traumatize the spirit to hear, to see in black and white the level of vicious atrocities that have been committed against my people and me. And knowing full well that the stuff is continuing, because we know it's continuing, because here you are in 2009 writing a book about it, something that, has been written about, talked about, discussed, and unveiled, revealed. And so it's, so who's your intended audience?
My intended audience is anyone interested in thinking about American politics and political life and cultural life, and in questioning some of the shapes that really important political debates take. So, that would be a mixed race audience, a multiracial audience, and I've tried.
Okay, because anyone who's interested in thinking about these things.
Yes, because
and so anybody across the board, white, non-white, Asian, Hispanic.
Absolutely. Yes.
Poor, surviving in poverty, economic, middle class, any particular class of people.
No, it's
anybody interested in thinking about this.
I've tried to write it in such a way that anybody who is interested could pick it up and read it. And, like Whiteness of a Different Color, it focuses, it focuses on white ethnic groups, but it does so in a way to tell a story that I think is very important, not just about them, but about American political life and the way that race and difference kind of operates in our political culture. So in that book...
Okay, wait a minute. You answered the question.
Okay.
The words, it's like this gets wordy. I've been involved with words for a long time, and so that's just the very, very short of it, if you will, in terms of who I am and my story. Yet, that anyone who's thinking, and so what again becomes apparent to me as I listen to you, and it leads right to the next question that it was attached to that question, for what purpose? To think, you understand that thinking generates feelings, and feelings can guide behavior. So after we know about these atrocities, and after we begin to think about the bullshit, and this is from a narrative approach, and I use the term, what it is, different cultural lingo. This stuff, this poisonous stuff, these atrocious, these hidden, what do you call them in your book, that these things that white people have done?
Well, I think that there are...
Thinking about these political things that we're thinking about, what is it? It's terrorizing and traumatizing the people. That's what, from the words of a traumatologist, that's what it's called.
Right. Well, there certainly is still terror.
Acts of terror. That's what it would be. Acts of terror. And once we become aware and begin to think about these acts of terror, for me, this is where the problem comes up. I begin to feel. And what I feel when I recognize and review these acts of terror that have happened and continue to happen is damn mad, if you will. Angry. And anger is an appropriate response, to acts of injustice perpetrated against human life. And even animal life, here in America. And so then the next thing is what to do about it. And are there some suggestions in this book about what to do after we've begun to think about these things? Because, I am a student, if you will, of counter-racism as well, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with that program and that work and project, yet one thing that becomes crystal clear that I've learned about, my interactions with white people is the way they use words to confuse people, and confuse you. And as you begin, you answer the question, and then you begin to continue on with a whole lot more words, and then you ask me to buy this book with all these words and tell me all this atrocious shit. And then when I give you the money, we are in an economic recession, a depression is what it feels like for us, because we overstand, based on your work, that when white America, if you will, catch a cold, black America is the flu. So if the white America is in an economic recession, we just, straight out know what goes below depression. I would be up under there, way economically speaking. So I would give my hard on the economic stuff to buy this book, to read all these words, tell me about all the damn terror and trauma that's continuing to go on and has done stuff that, and then what? And you see, maybe that answers another question that I had. Those were just some sort of random thoughts, if you will, that I had as I listened to your spiel about this book and the work you've done. Earlier on, and when I came in, Victim of Racism would ask you a question. And so the question that I was following up with, based on your response to him, is how are you a racist? You said, I forget how the question went, Brother Victim of Racism, and yet Dr. Jacobson, you were saying, yes, you do practice, but the question is supposed to become, how is a person a racist?
No,
I'm wondering, how might you be a racist?
Well, I think that there's some distinctions to make here. What I was saying was that it's the more fruitful question for white people to ask is not, am I a racist, but how am I a racist? Because in one way or another, if we really pursue that line of questioning sincerely, we are going to discover ways that we have participated in or benefited by white privilege. That was what I was saying. That's a question for white people to ask other white people.
What's that?
How are they a racist? That's a question for white people to ask white people.
Well, that's a question for all of us to ask white people.
Well, it seems to me, with all the books, and it sounds like anyway, also, from your book, and even the description and what you talk about is in it, it sort of shows the how. It's based on the behaviors in terms of what people do very specifically. And you have outlined some things that white people have done in this society through the 60s, 70s, 90s, whatever.
Right.
And you talk about what they have done, actually. And I don't know, maybe here's just a little thing for you, and then I'm gonna be done. It seems maybe one way that you might recognize the races in you, if you will, how I experienced you, rather, I would say, how I have experienced you as racist is the way that you use words and continue, you answer the question and all this stuff, and it sort of divert us away from the primary question and point. And that's just something that it seems that white people tend to do, is just use a lot of words that start to kind of confuse you. And I know for me, being in the traumatized state that I am in, it's very difficult. I do not have the discipline and resolve most times, as Brother Victim of Racism does, in responding to bullshit, shit as I call it. And that does come from a narrative approach in the field of family therapy. Externalizing the stinky poo, as they call it. Yet as a woman of African descent, coming from where I'm from, it's externalizing the shit. It's looking at shit in the world, and just like sex therapists desensitized us to the words penis and vagina, I hope to desensitize the world to the word shit. Thank you so much for listening to me and share, and thanks for sharing with me as well.
Thanks
for the Victim of Racism for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for giving us a call and giving us your comments and feedback on the program. If you want to hang, that's cool. We had another caller, 301. Do you have a question for Dr. Jacobson? 301, are you there? His call was on the screen, but I am not seeing him. I did have a question, Dr. Jacobson. This goes back to pretty much what I was saying about, or what you said, that every white person in the system of white supremacy practices racism, white supremacy. Just being a white person in a system of white supremacy, you are around other racists, other white people who I would think, if there are no non-white people around, from time to time, I don't know how often, but from time to time, they talk about how they feel about non-white people and the value and place of non-white people in a system of white supremacy. Do you think that statement is accurate?
Well, I think it depends on who you are and what the circles are that you travel in. I think that in general that's probably true. I mean, I know that I have been in situations where I've had to call people out for things that they've said or implied, and I do that, and I think it's something that white people...
It would be I apologize for interrupting. It would be fantastic if you could give us like 3 explicit examples of things white people have said where you've called them out for their racism.
Well, I've heard people use epithets that they assumed that everyone in the room was going to be okay with, and they're shocked when you let them know that you're not. I've had people. I mean, and this isn't just. I mean, I've been in situations where people have said things all too comfortably about a lot of different groups. And it comes up in the classroom every now and then, not very often, but every now and then a student will say something that you can't let it go. You have to call them out. And I think that is work that can't just be left to people of color. You know, that's work for all of us to do.
Hmm. 301, are you there? Okay, just double checking to see if he was here. Okay. Let's see, before we wrap things up, you did talk about in your book for a white person, you referenced specifically in the book Gentleman's Agreement. Mm-hmm. If a white person is calling into question whether or not racism is being practiced, really doing anything to question or disrupt the system of white supremacy, that can put their whiteness, quote unquote, whether they're on the white team, in question. Could you elaborate on that for our listeners, please?
Well, I think that, it's interesting that you use the word team, because I think in this culture it's often experienced that way, that there is an assumption that you are, or that your orientation will be in such a way because of how you look or how one takes you to be. And so, depending on who you are, you'll often hear things, like I was saying before, you'll hear things said in comfort that you are not at all comfortable with. Gentleman's Agreement is based on the premise, this was written in the 40s, of a journalist posing as a Jew to write about anti-Semitism, and then kind of becoming, through his experience, because of the way he exposed himself to anti-Semitism, kind of becoming, in a sense, an honorary Jew. And I think that in our anti-racist work, that's what we need to do. We need to become that honorary group member of whatever the group is in question, knowing that burden is not ours, that we're not sharing in the burden of that, but that the work of calling people out, of giving name to certain kinds of habit or crime, that's important work that we can all be doing. And that's, I think, one of the messages that I can use my platform as a white professor to make that point to white students in a way that perhaps people of color could not.
I want to check before we wrap things up. I had one more question, but if 301 is there, I wanted to give him an opportunity to ask a question, he or she. 301, are you there? It's showing on the switchboard callers there, but not hearing. Last question before we wrap up the program. Number one, I think, as I said, non-white people tend to be very confused about racism, white supremacy. My suggestion, I think it is very constructive, particularly for non-white people. I suspect that you do not have hordes of non-white students in your class. I suspect you generally have mostly white students.
That is not true. No, it's interesting. I get, in my more general courses, that's true. But when I teach a seminar on race and race relations, definitely white students are in a minority.
Very interesting.
Extremely interesting.
A lot of the college courses that I participated in, even I took Julian Bond's class. Most of the students were white. Very interesting, particularly at an Ivy League school. That is very interesting. Well, definitely then for those classes, for sure. I think it would be very constructive if you told them exactly what you told us. In a system of white supremacy, if you are a white person, it's not a question of if you're a racist. It's a question of how this person practices racism, white supremacy. I think that would be fabulous. Maybe you do tell your students that. But
I do.
Oh, okay. I think that would be fabulous, and I think cherry on top, if you said, I am a racist white supremacist, I have found that is very constructive for non-white people, not in a name-calling sense, but just in a sense of being able to begin to attach faces to the problem. I think non-white people tend to talk about racism, white supremacy as a nebulous thing. Racism is out there. As though it's something in the atmosphere. They don't talk about it.
Or there's the occasional bigot, the KKK wizard, but nothing else. No, exactly.
And can I say that's a direct result of the process of having been psychologically traumatized by this thing called racism, white supremacy, because that is exactly how people who are psychologically traumatized behave. But what it does, it provides validation for something that it provides words. It's just like teaching a child, what things are. It gives them a language to define the reality that they're living at. They don't have the words for in their traumatized state. It validates their reality when they say, I believe this is racism. There's something about this doesn't seem right. Yet what I've found more often than not, white people will deny what they're saying or what they're doing is in fact, falls under the umbrella of racism, white supremacy, and the practice thereof. And, that's coming from a perspective of a traumatologist, if you will, and a scholar in the field of psychology, behavioral health, social work systems theory, emotional health. That's what it does. So validating that, putting the name, acknowledging it, taking responsibility, and it's also consistent with the process of recovery through the means of addiction science and so forth, supports it.